So let's stop for a second here. What is the agricultural revolution? You guys remember that one? When did that happen?
In the late 1600s.
Actually,
like 2500 BC.
1300s. Well, you have lots of revolutions. It's kind of a hard thing to say, especially in world history, because we talked about world agricultural revolutions affecting China at one time. Certain dynasties have an agricultural revolution. All it means is that it increases the yield of your product. That's it. That's what it means. But there are some specific critical time periods when this happens. And the very big one that we look at in Europe is in 1300s.
Is that
The invention of the plow?
Well, you had to invent the plow and the three-crop system and the padded harness before that, close to the 1100s, right? But it takes a while for this to really result, because what's the whole purpose of an agricultural revolution? What does this provide you that you didn't have before?
More food.
Food, which gives you people. And people gives you more specialization. And more specialization gives you more complex government. And more complex government gives you more technology. You remember that? That's like the beginning of civilization. But you guys all thought that that's only what happened at the very start of civilization. But the formula works continuously, which is one of the reasons why everyone saw population as a good thing. Because it allows you to do more stuff, more people, more specialization. More food, more people. And so then what comes up next? Well, scientific revolution. The scientific revolution was basically our systematic attempt to try to understand the world. The science.
That's the switch from faith in God to faith in science, right?
It is. It takes a long time, and in fact, at this time, in the 1500s, when this is really beginning, 1500 scientific revolution, all these scientists are religious. We talked about this. They're all religious. Because you better understand God by understanding His creation. You don't get a break from science and faith really until the 1800s. And that's actually going to be what the Enlightenment does. Scientific revolution is simply inductive reasoning. Do you know what inductive reasoning is? We talked about this. Sherlock Holmes, remember? He walks into a room. He sees the body. Does he have to prove that there's a dead body there? He's got it. Okay. You use deductive reasoning to look at all the possible options and then deduce, kind of deduct, remove things that don't fit to come up with an answer. Oddly enough, we think Sherlock Holmes, modern science guy, but deductive reasoning is what we had in the Middle Ages. We know that God exists. We know nature. We know that kings are kings. We don't question it, so we explain why. We know that the sun rises and sets. Why do we know this? Because we see it every day. How stupid of a question is that? Inductive reasoning is the exact opposite. I come into the room and I don't know anything. I don't trust anything. I have to be proven everything. So, okay, I see the sun rise, but that doesn't mean that that's what it is. It could be something else. I have to find out. In fact, we happen to know it's not what happens. What happens? Why do we see the sun rise and set?
Because we rotate.
Because we rotate, right? But how would you know that? Well, if you invent a telescope and you can look at the phases of Venus and you can look at the phases of the moons on other planets, and you can realize you can't get those angles unless there's a sun in the middle. So you can prove it. Go ahead.
What would the definition of inductive reasoning be?
Inductive reasoning is to assume nothing and to test your conclusion. That's your definition. You assume nothing and you test through experimentation. That's why you guys think of the scientific method. Francis Bacon comes up with this. Go ahead.
So I'm thinking that this new idea of testing things scientifically is like them becoming enlightened. Is that not
Okay,
right?
not right. Good guess, though. And why? And I'll just be honest with you, because the enlightened people use that to define their identity. The science folks were all Christian. They're all deeply religious. Francis Bacon was deeply religious. He was also the guy who invents the scientific method. There's no break between faith and reason. You use science and reason to understand your faith. They're completely tied together. But you're thinking enlightened science because something else happened. So deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning were not incompatible. They were two different things, two different types of knowledge. For God, you don't prove that God exists. You can't. Just flat, you can't. Because he's not material. You can't touch him. So you can't weigh and measure and test. So you know that he exists. And this is the funny thing. Which gives you more certainty? Deductive reasoning or inductive reasoning?
They both give you a sense of certainty. Well, it depends on what you're talking about.
In science, can you ever be absolutely certain that your theory is going to... No, because somebody else can come up with a different idea. Deductive, you start off, he's dead. Let's explain it. You start off with it. The certainty is actually greater with deductive reasoning. We know God exists. We don't prove this. You know it. It's written into your heart. You know it. It's a certain assurance. But if we know that God exists and that he loves us, then we can deduce all sorts of things called theology. In the 13, 14, 15, even 1600s, the queen of all sciences is theology, because that would be the source of all truth. It's not until later. What happens is with the Enlightenment, we question this. And what the Enlightenment does is we use science to solve social problems. What we did with the scientific revolution is we're using inductive reasoning to solve material problems. The best example is when we're understanding the heliocentric theory. Helio, sun is in the center, as opposed to geocentric, earth is in the center. It's material, we can measure it. And of course it fits perfectly with experimentation and measurement. We don't use science to understand theology. Nobody even dares, because it doesn't make any sense. Francis Bacon, deeply religious, also huge on scientific method. If you're not testing things, it's not true. But you don't test your faith in God. You just know that. What the Enlightenment does is starts using scientific method. And we can see where this works. The United States is sometimes referred to as the child of the Enlightenment. The first daughter of the Enlightenment. Because we ask, why do kings rule? What's the answer? Because we let them. We get to figure it out. Can you use a scientific method to figure this out? You can use inductive reasoning. You can use deductive reasoning. They rule because God wants them to rule. Divine right of kings. What happens when the king does really horrible things? Does God really want horrible things to be happening? So then you start testing it. I don't believe that kings should rule. Then if I don't believe the king should rule, then what should happen? What should be the case?
People.
Yeah, John Locke. We hold these truths to be self-evident. This is a deductive truth. Self-evident means you don't have to prove this. All men are created equal. They're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. We don't prove this. We know it. That's the deductive side. Go ahead.
Now, you said people thought that God wouldn't want a king who did terrible things.
Yeah.
Now, what if, could they have taken it the other way and say there is no God because that king is doing terrible things?
That's a good question. Not then.
Okay.
Then they would say, no, he's not doing what God wants him to do, right? That's the one side. Or the other guy would say, no, the whole nature of king. Have you ever seen a really good king? Every time you get there, you get the wealth, you get the power, you start being corrupted. So it's the nature. This John Locke argument is kind of a combination, but it is scientific theory. If we hold that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, then these things follow. And so you don't have a kingdom, you have a democracy. That's kind of the first Enlightenment. So when we start thinking about Enlightenment, we usually think in terms of politics. And for the United States, for example, we're all in favor of politics. Political Enlightenment. And basically we're saying, we decide these things. The people decide. What happens in the French Revolution? Did we talk about this? Maybe not in this class. We hadn't been up there yet. But in the French Revolution, what do you start saying? You know, in the American Revolution, the colony is separated from England. And so for us to break away, we just break the connection. But what about the French Revolution? Where are the people?
They're all in France.
So how do you break that connection?
By killing everyone.
You have to transform society and start questioning everything. And what they start doing is they start questioning the church. They start questioning theology. They start questioning God. And so your idea about bad king, we don't believe in God, that's exactly what they did. And that is Enlightenment thought. And so this will bring up a sense of atheism. It gets triggered first, but it doesn't succeed because France is not something anybody wants to repeat. You invent the guillotine in order to kill that many more people because you're just if you don't agree with them, you get killed. There's no standard. The standard is whatever you think. So Robespierre, who's the guy who's killing thousands and thousands of people, what happens to him? He gets killed too because there's no standard. So nobody wants to do that. And in fact, the irony of ironies, we'll talk about this, but the French Revolution inspires this getting rid of the king. They kill the king. Well, who comes up within 5 years? Napoleon. Who gets crowned emperor? The king of kings. Because he restores order. They want that. So these ideas, not all in favor. The Enlightenment bringing about this is going to be in trouble. By the time you get to the 1850s, we start thinking of the Enlightenment as atheism, as thinking science only. It takes a long time for that to happen. After the Enlightenment, Industrial Revolution. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but let me just say, the Industrial Revolution is going to be what fixes imperialism and mercantilism. Because every time you bring the raw materials home, what do you have to do in order to get your profit?
Make it as cheap as possible.
And so Industrial Revolution is when you replace human labor with machine labor. And so you're able to transform the raw material into finished products so much quicker. And if you can do that, then your wealth is going to skyrocket. Take a wild guess where the Industrial Revolution begins. England. And who is the most powerful empire in the world 20 years after it sweeps through England? Totally, that's what happens. And since we know that cultural diffusion is inevitable, even though we don't want these guys to be industrialized, what do you think is going to inevitably happen, say, by 1950? India will be
Industrialized.
more industrialized. They're still not industrialized, but they'll be more industrialized because you can't stop cultural diffusion. It takes a long time, maybe 200 years. We'll talk about that. Questions, comments, words of wisdom? We will see you guys on Wednesday.